Good evening. I want to welcome everyone here to our next installment of the study of First Samuel. And tonight we're going to be doing chapters 11 and 12. And we'll begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us in his commands and commands us to be engrossed in the words of Torah. Okay, tonight we are looking at the 11th and 12th chapters of the first book of Samuel, and what that does for us is it will finish off the ministry, the judging ministry, the judging office of Samuel. There's no more judges after Samuel. And then we will look at the beginning of Saul's monarchy, I guess you'd say, his reign as the king of Israel. So, kind of an interesting beginning here in 1 Samuel 11. So now Nahash the Ammonite marched up and encamped against Jabesh-Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a treaty with us, and we will serve you." But Nahash the Ammonite said, "Only on this condition will I make a treaty with you, by gouging out the right eye of every one of you. Thus I will bring disgrace on all Israel." So the elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days respite, so we may send messengers throughout all the territory of Israel. If no one comes to deliver us, we will surrender to you." When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and spoke these words in the hearing of the people, all the people lifted up their voice and wept. Now, behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen. So Saul asked, "Why are you the people weeping?" And they told him the words of the men of Jabesh. All right, so this is kind of a tough beginning here. The Ammonites, who were they? Okay, and here we are. We're right in this area right here, King Saul. Okay, and I found this chronology as I was studying this week, and I thought it was kind of interesting just to give us an idea of where we are. Now, we're right here in this toward the tail end of Samuel's office of judge, and it's interesting that about the time that Saul is born, then this is just a few years before Samson is a judge, and so these things kind of overlap a little bit. The Battle of Aphek, where they lost the Ark of the Covenant, was actually right smack in the middle of Samson's life. So while they lost the Ark up there in the hills of Ephraim, Samson was down further further down in Israel, and he was having his own battles with the Philistines. So just kind of interesting if you accept all of these particular timelines, and I give you that to study later on. And there's the kind of the breakdown of the various chapters. And this is the area again where we're talking about a lot of the area that we're going to be talking about today is in here. And then this is actually the full area. This area down here being a lot of the tribe of Benjamin, and but Jabesh-Gilead is way up here, and it is in the territory of Manasseh. And if you remember, Jabesh-Gilead did not participate in the in the punishment battles against the Benjamites, the tribe of Benjamin, and so that's when they went in and they took the young virgins from Jabesh-Gilead to supply wives for the men of Benjamin, who there were only 600 of them left over. So anyway, that's a little history if you remember back on that. All right. So this guy Nahash, the Ammonites, he was an Ammonite, and they were Israel's enemies. They had a territory to the east of the traditional territories of Gad and Reuben, and they were descendants of Lot. And Jephthah had defeated them earlier, back in Judges chapter 11, and so this guy's name Nahash means serpent. And so he was looking to revenge Japheth's victory. A couple of hundred years before that, and evidently those people in the Middle East have long memories. So Jabesh-Gilead is just a few miles south of the Galilee, and it's over on the east side of the Jordan River. Now, these guys, the men of Jabesh-Gilead said, yeah, they would sue for peace. They would, they didn't want to fight. They'll just sue for peace, and they would surrender, and thinking that they would have the standard suzerain treaty where the victor gets together with the vanquished, and they cut some animals in half, and then they walk through the animals and said, okay, let us be like this to these animals here, if we don't follow up with this treaty, or if we don't obey this treaty. And so that's pretty much what they were thinking this would be. But Nahash had a habit of people that he conquered, that he would gouge out the right eye of all of the men. And what that did was that then you could no longer use your right eye to sight down your arrow to shoot an arrow. And unless you were Benjamites who were left-handed, this could be a serious detriment to your warfighting capability. Plus, with your right eye being gone, that's the eye that you peek around the corner of your shield with. You got your shield in your left hand, and so you peek around the shield with your right eye. Well, if you don't have a right eye, then you got to expose more of your face. And again, it just makes it more difficult to have an armed uprising. The idea of mutilation of the populace or of the vanquished foes was kind of common back in those days. There were times where they would do things like cut off their big toes, so that it affected their balance. They couldn't really effectively be a swordsman or whatever, because it does affect your balance a little bit. Sometimes they would take the horses of the vanquished, and they would hamstring them so that their horses could no longer be used in battle. There were others that they did just for meanness. Sometimes they'd cut off their nose so that they're real ugly, and then cut off their ears and things. So this idea of poking out their right eye was not unknown back in those days. All right, and so there's some extra biblical readings that say that in the area around there that had been conquered by Nahash, that there was not one single Israelite in that area that had been conquered on the east side of the Jordan that had his right eye intact. Every single Israelite on that side of the river had lost their right eye to Nahash. And so there had been like 700 or 7,000, I mean, had somehow escaped, and they'd gotten down here to Jabesh-Gilead, and they hold up there. And then that's when, you know, they said, okay, yeah, we'll give up if you'll just have a standard treaty where we walk through the animals, and you know, that's the treaty. Uh, Sort of like, you remember going back to Abraham, where God's had him fillet the animals on either side, and then God walked through the middle of the animals in a unilateral treaty. But generally speaking, both parties would walk through it, and with the idea in mind that, um, you know, may this be done to me if I don't obey this treaty. And so you can imagine their horror there, which they said, no, we're gonna gouge out your right eye. And I don't know about you, but I'm a little bit particular about my right eye, and so that would not have been a real palatable thing to me, that's for sure. All right, so um, anyway, they went to, they said to Nahash, well, give us 7 days, and let us go to Israel and see if anybody will be our champion, and will rescue us. And Nahash was so, you know, he was really so sure that he was going to have victory, that he said, yeah, sure, go on. And basically, another thing that he was trying to do was um, he was trying to draw Israel on the west side of the river into battle against him, because he was sure that he could defeat Israel and then take that land too. So, you know, and you remember at this time in their history, they were still a collection of tribal entities. They were not um, a nation of Israel. They were the tribes of Israel. And so they still had, you know, they had as a loose confederation, loose association, but they weren't a unified country yet, or unified nation. But they were getting that way. It was more and more leading that direction. And Nahash knew this, and that's why he had said, well, I'm going to cut out your eye, and so that you would be, what was the word that and you would bring disgrace on all Israel. And the word there for the disgrace was also a word that they would use for when a woman was violated, and so then, you know, she would be disgraced. Okay, and so that's kind of plus it's kind of gruesome, you know, everybody wearing an eye patch or something like Long John Silver. So or like Ben Crenshaw here in Houston. So anyway, he went ahead and he let them go, and so they sent to where Saul was, and you know, where was Saul? He would, you know, he had been anointed the king, and Saul was out in the field plowing. He had a couple of oxen, and he had a plow, and he's walking behind him, and he's plowing the ground. He's still farming. And so, you know, he had not received any direction from God and or Samuel that we know of. And so, you know, that's if he was the king now, he just said, well, I don't have any direction on this thing. Okay, I'm going to go, and king or not, I got to get my crops in. So that kind of shows some of his humility. And plus, you know, remember, Saul was from a very, very wealthy family. So he would not, you know, a wealthy landowner would not work the land himself. He would have hirelings to do that. But there's old Saul out there doing this himself. So he was willing to do hard work, and at this point in his life, he was a pretty humble man, and not self-serving, not self-centered like later on. Once he got the power, what is it that they say? Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that was the poster child for that one is Saul. All right. Any comments or questions so far? Just the rules. You just unmute yourself and say what you got to say. Nothing, huh? Okay. Well, going on then. Then the Ruach of God suddenly rushed on Saul when he had heard those words, and his anger blazed. So he took a pair of oxen, cut them in pieces, and sent them out through all the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers, saying, "Whoever doesn't come out after Saul and after Samuel, this same thing is going to be done to his oxen." And so the dread of Adonai fell on the people, and they came out as one man. He numbered them in Bezek and Bnei Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. So they said to the messengers who came, "Thus will you say to the men of Jabesh-Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, you will have deliverance." The messengers came and told the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Then the men of Jabesh said, now they're giving word back to Nahash, and which is, it's kind of interesting. The wording here says, "Tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever seems good to you." And in other translations, it says, "And you can do whatever seems good in your eyes." And it's a play on words, because he's going to gouge out their eye. Well, he's saying, yeah, do whatever is good in your eye. And so it was that the following day, then, before they could surrender, Saul had divided the people up into 3 columns. They penetrated into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of day. And it came about that the survivors were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. So the important part about this, the Spirit of God came on Saul. At this point now, he was God was starting to work in his life, and it just stirred him up. And he had a plan. He got everybody together. He took one of the things that he did was he took the his oxen that he was plowing with, and he chopped them up into pieces and sent messengers all over Israel, and said, "I'm going to do this to your oxen if you don't come out and follow me." And so that's pretty good incentive. And it's also very reminiscent of the Benjamite uh, uh, episode, uh, which was a couple hundred years before that, where the Levites sent the parts of the concubine around Israel. And here, Saul is also a Benjamite, so that imagery there was still very real to him, I'm sure. And his connection with Jabesh-Gilead, if you remember, that it was the women, like I said, the virgins of Jabesh-Gilead that were taken and given to the survivors of the men of Benjamin, because Israel had killed all the rest of the tribe of Benjamin except for 600 men. I mean, women and children, babies, everybody had been killed, and only left these 600 men. And so then they came to their senses and said, "What have we done? We've destroyed our brother." And so that's when they said, "Well, okay, we're going to have get these wives from Jabesh-Gilead." So some of Saul's ancestors might have been from Jabesh-Gilead, so that he had a connection there. There's basically a 66% chance that his ancestors came from Jabesh-Gilead. All right, so he went ahead and he gathered up. It said 300,000 men, and 30,000 from Judah, and um, that's a lot. I mean, assuming that you're talking, we've talked about before where the word Eleph, does that mean 1,000 here, or does that mean a a group, or because if it means 1,000 instead of the 100, then yeah, it's 300,000. If the decimal place is 1 point over, that it'd be 30,000. That's still a lot of folks going after out there to battle on these things. And either way, it was seemed like everybody, all of Israel, came together and uh, were ready to fight the Ammonites. So and they'd mentioned that it was like 300,000 from Israel, or from the Israelites, and 30,000 from Judah. That kind of shows us that the book of Samuel was written somewhat later on, where maybe in the possibly even after um, the reign of Solomon. So we don't know, but it's interesting that that division between Israel and Judah was actually mentioned. And so the messengers then they went to Jabesh Gilead, and then Jabesh sent word to Nahash of their impending surrender. And so one of the things that they kind of gave the Ammonites the impression that, okay, yeah, we can stand down, because these guys didn't get anybody to surrender to them. So let's go ahead and get a good night's sleep, and just rest up your eye pokers, because tomorrow we're just going to poke out some eyes, and then we'll be done. We can go home. And so they weren't ready for battle. And so and that's where in verse it where they're actually talking to these people, and it says, yeah, you can do to us whatever is good in your eyes. And interesting play on words. So Saul then divided his troops up into three divisions, and they attacked the Ammonites early in the morning, just before dawn. So these guys were, they were hard asleep, fast asleep, and this was like Gideon had done. And so this morning watch, it lasted from 2 to 6 in the morning, and so that's that was kind of a standard way of counting the time at that time of the world. So, and remember that God slew the Egyptian soldiers that in the Red Sea at the morning watch. And so maybe the writer was talking about this in the same light, the morning watch, so that it harked back to a previous victory that God had, another miraculous victory. So anyway, the Ammonites were not expecting this at all, and as such, then Israel, under the leadership of Saul, came in, thoroughly defeated these guys. I mean, they were thoroughly routed. The Bible says that there were none of them, no two men together. In other words, they scattered in every direction, and so that everybody was on their own, every man for himself, and no one was, there weren't any pockets of resistance. They were all scattered and gone. So going on to verse 12, then the people said to Samuel, who was it who said, should Saul reign over us? Bring the men so that we may put them to death. But Saul replied, no man will be put to death this day, for today Adonai has brought deliverance to Israel. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let's go to Gilgal, reaffirm the kingdom there." So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before Adonai in Gilgal. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before Adonai, and there Saul and all of his men rejoiced greatly. All the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Okay, so here we see somebody. You remember last week we talked about they talked about, when they declared that Saul was going to be king, and there were valiant men that went up with Saul. But then there were others that they were less enthusiastic about Paul and about Saul, and just saying, who is this guy? What bona fides does he have that we should follow him? And they're basically just a bunch of rats and frats and kind of guys that they didn't want Saul didn't want Saul in there. And so then after this victory, there were people that evidently there was a pretty good group of folks that didn't want Saul. And so they came to Samuel and said, who were those guys that said that they didn't want Saul? And, maybe we should just go and kill them because they're rebels already and they don't deserve to live. And, but Saul then, no, he said, no, there's been enough killing today already. No one's going to be put to death. And, later on in his reign, he may have had a different idea, but at this point, he was not willing to kill any of his own people. And so you gotta give him credit for that, that he didn't want to kill anybody, and it was just good. So then Samuel said, well, come on down. Let's go down to Gilgal, and we'll reaffirm the kingdom there. And so they went on down to Gilgal. Now, there's a couple of places that that identify as Gilgal. The one was right there on the Jordan River, just on the west side of the Jordan River. But you remember that was the staging ground for Israel as they were making the conquest into the Canaan land, with Joshua. And so that was also where they had a renewal of the covenant with God. It was, and they were there for a good long time. And so it was a place that maybe not in the actual memories of the people, but in the corporate memory of the ancestors and the stories and everything. They knew that Gilgal was a place of renewal and recommitment. So Samuel said, let's go back down there, and we will reaffirm the kingdom that God has granted you a king, and Saul is the king, reaffirming that. And also they went through and reaffirmed the covenant that God had with Israel, and that basically, if you will follow God, then it will go well with you. So so they went on down to Gilgal and had the basically maybe you could call it a coronation, or just a reaffirming that the Saul was the king. Now the people, they gave their united support to Saul as their king there at Gilgal, and this is the first of three important meetings with Samuel and Saul at Gilgal. The second time was the time that Saul failed to wait for the prophet, offered a sacrifice prematurely, and received the prophet's rebuke. That'll be in chapter 13. We'll look at that next week. And then the third meeting was when God rejected Saul as king for his disobedient pride following his victory over the Amalekites. And that's in chapter 15. And again, we will look at that because next week I think we're gonna do chapters 13, 14, and 15 next week. And I may not get that far, but that's the plan anyway, to get through 3 chapters next week. And so anyway, what did they do? They offered peace offerings to express thanks to God for his goodness. And so these kind of offerings that were given at that point, there, you'd have a burnt offering. Part of the animal would be burned up, but then a major portion of it, the good part, the things that were edible, because the intestines and the organs and that sort of thing, that was burned up. The hide, the head, that sort of thing. But then, the ribeyes and the flank steak and the brisket and all that kind of stuff, they got cut out, and that then could be a proper barbecue, and then they could eat that with the priests, and it was more like a big banquet. And we do know about barbecue here, so that's what would happen during a peace offering or a Thanksgiving offering. And that's certainly what happened here, is that they slaughtered the animals and they ate them, and everybody was having a good time. And compared this time of joy and refreshing to just a day or two earlier, a few days earlier, where they had come into where Saul was plowing and told him about what was fixing to happen to Jabesh-Gilead, and they were weeping, and so now their weeping has given way to rejoicing. So in this whole incident here, we can see that Saul was he was humble and he was hardworking, and then God's Spirit empowered him and gave him wisdom and victory. And so Saul, to his credit, he gave God all the credit. He said it was Adonai that was there, that it was but for him, and that's how we won our victory, is through Adonai. And so he was merciful to his critics, and so God also gave him favor in the eyes of his people. All right, now that finishes out chapter 11. Any comments or questions so far before we go on to chapter 12? Any comments? Okay, well, shoot, just lost somebody. All right. Um, Going on to chapter 12. Then, then Samuel said to all Israel, "Behold, I have listened to your voice and all you said to me, and set a king over you. Now here's the king who will go before you. While I am old and gray, also here are my sons with you. I have gone before you from my youth to this day. Here I am, witness against me before Adonai and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken, and whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I defrauded, or whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I taken a bribe to look the other way? I will restore it to you." They replied, "You haven't defrauded us, or oppressed us, or taken anything from anyone's hand." Then he said to them, "Adonai is then a witness against you, and his anointed is a witness this day, that you have found nothing, that you have not found anything in my hand. He is a witness." They replied. Okay, so why do you think that Samuel needed to justify his public behavior, or, his behavior as a as a judge? That why did he have to justify this publicly and openly like that? So maybe it was because he knew that the people had rebelled against God by demanding a king. They would experience discipline from the Lord, and when it came, he didn't want anyone to think that he was responsible for it. So um, it was also likely that Samuel took the people's request for a king. Well, we know he did it. That he took it as a personal rejection of himself, and so here he is telling them. He says, "Look, now, I've not done anything that that you should be, going against me for?" And they agreed that he was above reproach. He had done everything right. It's a good thing he didn't say that about his sons, because his sons were kind of rascals. And so he wanted to show the people that they had no reason to reject him because of his behavior. So Samuel's words, they in a way, they expressed a personal pride, and the, and some people say that, and possibly they expressed the concern that no one should conclude that living a life of commitment to God as he had done, would bring God's discipline. So it wasn't, if they got disciplined, it wasn't because that that he had not lived his life properly. So, um, you know, by living, the discipline that would come would not be on his account, and so it would be because they were demanding a king, and so he was just vindicating himself from the type of rule that he had done in as a judge, and what was fixing to happen with them as they had a king. So um, the here, and also as back in verse or chapter 8, is there's a word, the verb to take, and so the kingship. Remember when they talked about what the king would do, and it was characterized by a tendency to take rather than to give, and so here he's contrasting that with, and I didn't ever move my stuff over. He contrasted that with his ministry of not taking anything, and his when he stepped down from his high office, then his hands were not they were not full of the public dole. Okay, they Samuel would not have fit in present day Washington D.C., because these people that can come in relatively not having a whole lot of money and on $175,000 salary, leave office 10 years later, and they're multimillionaires. And there's something wrong with that. And so Samuel is saying, hey, I didn't do that like those politicians in Washington D.C. will do several hundred years from now. So Samuel stepped down as Israel's judge at this point, and he turned his judicial function that he had over to Saul, and Saul being Israel's first king. Now, we can say that he retired as a judge, but Samuel did not retire from public office, because he continued on as the prophet of Israel. And he did that until he passed away, until he died. So, and we see that this was the pattern for the rest of Israel during the time that they would have kings, that there would be a king, but there would also be a prophet in Israel, who not necessarily, in fact, I'm trying to think, I can't think of a time where the prophet of Israel was also the high priest, the Kohen Hagadol. Okay, Kohen Gadol. So Samuel is just, he's just saying here, okay, I'm done. This part of my life is over. I'm no longer a judge. I retire. But he picked up the mantle of being the prophet then. All right. So um, then Samuel said to the people, "It is Adonai appointed Moses and Aaron, and who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt." So he goes into the typical, we've seen it before, the Middle Eastern deal of going through history and reminding people of their history. So now stand still, so that I may plead with you before Adonai concerning all the righteous acts of Adonai, which he did for you and your fathers. When Jacob entered Egypt and your fathers cried out to Adonai, then Adonai sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot Adonai their God, so he gave them over to the hand of Sisera, captain of the army of Hatzor, and into the hands of the Philistines and into the hand of the king of Moab, who fought against them. So they cried out to Adonai and said, "We have sinned because we have forsaken Adonai, and we worshipped the Baalim and the Ashtaroth. But now deliver us from the hand of our enemies, and we will worship you." Then Adonai sent Jerubbaal, Bedan, Jephthah, and Samuel, and delivered you from the hand of your enemies on every side, so that you might live securely. But when you saw Nahash, king of the Ammonites, marching against you, you said to me, "No, but a king must reign over us, even though Adonai, your king, your God, is your king." And so, um, you know, God had never given the people an occasion to um, to demand a king. They just wanted to be like all of the other nations and so forth. And so, uh, in the past, he had delivered them. He had raised up a judge, a military leader, something that would go against the enemy. They would beat back the enemy, and when they had confessed their sins, when they had repented, and they had sought for God's help. So, but then they would go into that cycle again of being unfaithful to God and disobey His law, and but God remained faithful and in all of His promises. So, just as a side deal up here, it said Adonai sent Jerubbaal, Bedan, Jephthah, and Samuel. That Bedan may be a copyist or erroneous reference, I guess you'd say, to Balak and not Bedan. Sometimes those little Hebrew letters, they kind of get a little bit strange looking. All right, so going ahead. Now therefore, here is the king whom you have chosen and whom you have asked for, and behold, Adonai has set him as king over you. If you fear Adonai and worship him and listen to his voice and do not rebel against the command of Adonai, then both you as well as the king who reigns over you will be following Adonai your God. But if you do not listen to the voice of Adonai and rebel against the command of Adonai, then the hand of Adonai will be against you and against your fathers. Now stand and see this great thing that Adonai will do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest season today? I will call Adonai that he may send thunder and rain. Then you will know and you will see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of Adonai by asking for yourselves a king. So Samuel prayed to Adonai, and Adonai sent thunder and rain that day. Then all the people greatly feared Adonai and Samuel. Okay, now, in the Hebrew, there's a construct. Um, the king whom you have chosen, whom you have asked for. That shows that the people had not just requested a king; they had demanded it out of this, hard-headedness and strong will. So now that the key to Israel's future blessing through all of this was that they're going to have to still fear Adonai, serve him, listen to the voice of the Mosaic, of his voice, the king's voice, through the Mosaic law. Remember that one of the requirements Moses was saying that, in his prophetic farewell speech, he says, "Now you're gonna have a king." And one of the things that God had told them before was that each king was to sit down and write out the entire instructions that God had given them, write out Torah, the law of Moses from Mount Sinai. He's supposed to write this down in his own scroll, and he is to read from it every day. So now Samuel is telling the people here that, okay, if you will follow God and you're following your king's voice through the Mosaic law, as if he follows Mosaic law and you follow him, then and the prophets also, and you don't rebel against them, then you will be blessed. And the major message, I guess, of the books of Samuel comes through again with Samuel's final words here, that just keep following the Lord, stay in there, and just follow the Lord, and it will go well for you. But if you know if you do that, then it would result in fertility in all kinds of ways. Every kind, your flocks will increase, your money will increase, you'll have water and so forth. So um, the God confirmed the truth of Samuel's words supernaturally then when he sent rain. Now, this time in Israel, they said it was the grain harvest, and so it would have been a time where it was generally dry. Now, those of you that have ever been around any kind of farming or anything like that, you know that one of the things that you do not want is to have a bunch of rain just as you're getting ready to harvest your crops. Okay. You see that a lot of times where guys will go out around here. I live in an agricultural community, and they'll be working night and day to try to bring in a hay crop before it rains, or corn or something like that. When I was growing up on a farm, a big heavy rain just as we're trying to get into the fields to harvest the cotton would ruin your crop. I mean, you would just be ruined for the year. So here, God, I think Samuel, he said, just to show you now what can happen, and he prayed to God, and he made it rain and thunder right on that area where they were. So just to let the people know that you know what, it's it can go very badly for you if you cross me. Don't cross me. And even Josephus referred to this event, said that he called this a winter storm in the midst of harvest. So um, Samuel actually, he displayed the awesome power of God by and that he had an in with God because he just prayed up a storm, and that was also a fitting curtain call for the end of Samuel's duties as a judge. So then, finishing out the chapter here, and all the people said to Samuel, "Pray for your servants to Adonai your God, that we will not die, for we have added to all of our sins this evil by asking for ourselves a king." Samuel said to the people, "Fear not, indeed you have done all this evil. Yet do not turn aside from following Adonai, but worship Adonai with all your heart. Do not turn aside to go after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are futile. For Adonai will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased Adonai to make you a people to himself. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against Adonai by ceasing to pray for you. Yet I will keep instructing you in the good and straight way. Only fear Adonai and worship him in truth with all your heart, considering how magnificently he has dealt with you. But if you persist in acting wickedly, you will be swept away, both you and your king. So um, the people's rebellion against God was not something that they couldn't bring it back. They couldn't undo it. It's like those words that you say sometimes in anger or whatever, and the words leave your mouth, and you just wish you could grab them back. And I have been guilty of admitting a lot of stupidity in my life that I wish I could reach out there and grab those words back look around and said, hopefully nobody heard that, but they did. And so, there were consequences then that would follow. And, but Samuel told him and said, look, if you follow the Lord and just keep following the Lord, don't go astray, you'll be okay. And you don't have to worry that God is going to abandon you, and because you've made this sin of wanting a king instead of wanting God to be your king. All right, yeah, you've sinned, but all is not lost. Just keep following God, and then if the king is also does all of that, follows God like he's supposed to do, then everything will be fine. If not, it's one of those things again that the conditional uh, blessing and cursing thing is, if you don't follow God, if your king does not follow God, then the consequence of that will be that you will be swept away. You and your king will be gone. You'll be swept out of the land, and you'll be in exile. And of course, that's exactly what we see later on. So, anyway, that concludes chapter 12. Now, next three chapters, 13, 14, and 15, we'll talk about the reign of King Saul, and so forth. So kind of interesting stuff. I was actually, I've been up on the place where Saul was killed, or where he killed himself anyway, and where they hung his body up on the hill. Been up on that hill. It's kind of makes it come alive when you're not Saul, but I mean the story makes the story come alive when you can actually be up there and see it. So all of these things, sometimes when I'm teaching these things, some are more real to me than others, because if you've actually been in that place where it actually happens. So anyway, looking forward to that. Any comments or questions on tonight's lesson? I know I was talking really fast, but had a lot of words to get out. Any comments or questions?
I just like to give a people's advocate, human viewpoint piece to the little. There was nothing that really happened that caused them to want a king. Well, from the people's viewpoint, there was. If you look at over the last several hundred years, the Philistines had gone from being right on the shore of the Mediterranean to be read earlier in Samuel, where they had infiltrated to the point that they controlled the entire ironworks and were still infiltrating, to the point where the Israelites had a hard time fighting against the Philistines. And the tribe of Dan was another piece of it, where they were right in that corridor. Now, I have never been there, but the way I picture it is there's a gap where the Philistines could get in from the area around the Mediterranean into the inland, and the people of Dan had at one time been in that location, kept getting kicked, and so they moved themselves further north. So my point is, they, as again, human viewpoint, they're getting overrun by the Philistines. If we have a king, we can do better than this, try to keep the Philistines out. And so I think that was a big piece of their wanting the king, in addition to the rebellion and so on. Now, that in no way detours from what you said. Had they been following God like they should, they wouldn't have been in that position, and the Philistines wouldn't have been infiltrated. But from a human viewpoint, they figured that just like Saul did in this first battle here, he was able to draw from all 12 tribes to raise up an army to go against an enemy, whereas a bunch of tribes, they couldn't do that. You've got Samson fighting the Philistines in one part of Israel, while in another part of Israel, the ark is getting stolen. So anyway, they just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah. Well, that is a good point. That from their point of view, from their from their perspective, yeah, they needed a king. Um, but at the same time, the other side of it is, had they just followed God, he would never have allowed those other countries to impinge on their territory. The other thing that they didn't do was, when they conquered the land, they did not go out in there and do what God had told them to do, was to wipe everything clean, drive the people away. You didn't have to kill them, just drive them out of the land, just get rid of them somehow. You know, make the people in Gaza go down to down to Egypt, and make the people up in the various places. So, look how many years after the conquest that the Jebusites held on to Jerusalem. It wasn't until David came along and kicked them out, and that was let's see, that would have been 600 or 700 years that that the Jebusites were still in place, where they should have been kicked out by the people during the conquest. So, but there again, that from their point of view, yeah, they needed a king because maybe God had not dealt with them like he should have, and they're looking at the oppressors by being the oppressor's fault, and not their own for not following God. And there again, that's a valid point that they um, would look at that from their point of view. Now,